I want you to take a moment and really imagine hitting the absolute lowest point in your life. Just try to put yourself there.
Yeah, that really primal, bottom-of-the-barrel mindset.
Exactly. You are literally running for your survival. You've been stripped of your home, your career, your comforts, and, your reputation.
Oh, and you're physically exhausted.
Right. Operating on zero sleep, surrounded by people who actively want to see you ruined. Now imagine somehow using that exact horrifying moment, that precise crucible of pain, to produce some of the most beautiful, pure, spiritual records in human history.
I mean, it sounds totally counterintuitive to, well, everything we know about human nature.
It really does.
Because when a person is in profound survival mode, the biological instinct is purely focused on getting through the next 60 minutes. Higher order thinking, creativity, and profound spiritual meditation, those are almost universally considered luxuries of peacetime.
Right, they require safety.
Exactly. Safety and a calm nervous system.
But that impossible contradiction is actually what brings us here today. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to explore the spiritual journey of David through Psalms 1 through 17.
It's such a fascinating stretch of text.
It really is. We are diving into how David transitioned from a state of desperate, unfiltered lament to soaring, transcendent praise. We're looking at a wealth of theological analysis, devotional commentary, and the raw ancient texts themselves to uncover how his total surrender to God in the darkest of times created a very real, functional blueprint for your own spiritual life.
And to grasp how radical that blueprint is, we have to completely strip away the sanitized Sunday school image of David.
Oh, totally. Forget the flannel graph.
Right, forget the comfortable king sitting on a velvet throne with a golden crown, casually plucking a harp in a palace. The texts we're examining today require an entirely different mental framework.
And chronologically, this is just vital to understand. Because when people think of David's emotionally heavy, tear-soaked poetry, they almost always jump straight to the infamous Bathsheba incident.
All right, they go straight to Psalm 51.
Yes, they think of the crushing, suffocating guilt and desperate repentance. But the emotional texture here is it's entirely different. David isn't sitting in a palace wrestling with the fallout of his own moral failure.
No, not at all. These are the wilderness psalms.
He's a fugitive.
Exactly, running for his literal life from the intensely jealous King Saul. So the enemy here isn't his own internal sin. It is an external, deeply unfair political machine that is hunting him down. He is experiencing raw terror and deep injustice.
And we really need to ground this in the physical reality of the Judean wilderness. Because we aren't talking about a pleasant camping trip in a forest.
No, it's brutal.
It is a brutal, unforgiving landscape. It's a jagged terrain of sun-baked ravines, suffocating heat during the day, and then these bone-chilling drops in temperature at night.
And water is incredibly scarce out there.
Right. David is hiding in limestone caves where the acoustics echo every snapping twig, which keeps his nervous system in a constant state of hyperarousal. I mean, he is dirty, starving, and hunted.
Which presents a massive psychological shock when you consider the trajectory he was just on.
Oh, the whiplash is insane.
Right. Just a short time before fleeing into this wasteland, David was the ultimate national hero. He had just defeated Goliath.
The ultimate underdog victory.
Exactly. He was riding a wave of adulation where the entire nation was literally singing, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands.
And that level of fame and success happening that quickly, it's intoxicating. It naturally breeds this enormous sense of self-reliance. You start believing your own hype.
You really do.
You think your strength, your cleverness, and your charisma are what keep you safe.
And that's why the wilderness effectively serves as a brutal intervention. The overarching theological analysis of this period suggests the wilderness wasn't an accident.
It wasn't just a streak of bad luck.
Right, or a mere political misfortune. It was a severe, necessary training ground designed to completely dismantle that rising human pride. It forced an ego death.
It completely strips away the illusion of control. It's like a high-powered executive who defines their entire identity by their corner office, their staff, and their bank accounts, suddenly finding themselves dropped into the middle of a hostile jungle with nothing but the clothes on their back.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Right. The titles mean nothing. The money means nothing. You are forced to confront the core of who you actually are when every external support structure is violently ripped away.
And what we see in the text is that David is forced into a state of absolute, unavoidable dependence. But the poetry that emerges from this deprivation is shocking.
It really is.
I mean, in Psalm 1, David writes about delighting in God's law, meditating on it day and night, being like a tree planted by streams of water.
And that is what creates such intense cognitive dissonance for me as a reader, because he is writing about serene, endless streams of water while physically hiding in a dry, dusty cave wondering if he'll survive the night.
It makes no logical sense.
None. The serenity in Psalm 1 isn't born out of a peaceful environment, right? It seems to be born out of absolute desperation. When your physical reality offers zero comfort, the spiritual reality has to become your literal sustenance.
Yeah, and that survival instinct bleeds all over these pages. Because while Song 1 sets this beautiful structural foundation, the actual emotional journey through the following chapters is incredibly heavy.
It gets so dark.
It does. The text contains some intense, raw, and genuinely shocking anger.
The lament language is so visceral. In Psalm 6, David writes that he is so exhausted from groaning that he weeps until his bed is drenched with tears.
And it gets even more intense than that.
Yeah, in Psalm 10, he essentially demands answers from heaven, crying out, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?"
And then in Psalm 17, the imagery becomes downright violent. He describes his enemies as hungry lions crouching in the thickets, ready to tear him apart. And he doesn't just pray for a shield or an escape route.
He prays for them to be destroyed.
Exactly. He begs God to rise up, confront them, and bring them down with the sword.
And that brings up a really fascinating friction point, because when modern readers encounter these visceral curses and demands for divine violence, it feels incredibly unpolished.
Oh, absolutely.
It feels like spiritual immaturity, you know? We are conditioned to think a holy person should be turning the other cheek, practicing radical forgiveness, maintaining this Zen-like calm. Praying for your enemies to be crushed feels like a failure of faith.
But that is actually one of the most significant theological misconceptions regarding the Psalms. The deep analysis of these specific laments reveals that this raw anger is actually the mechanism of profound spiritual surrender.
Okay, I really want to break down that mechanism.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, shouting out your rage does not look like surrender.
It doesn't. But consider the psychological alternative. When a person is deeply wronged and hunted unjustly, the natural human response is to hold on to that rage, let it fester into resentment, and eventually mobilize it into violent retaliation.
Taking matters into your own hands.
Precisely. By pouring out every single drop of his rage, his terror, and his very real desire for vengeance directly to an ultimate authority, David is actively offloading the cognitive and spiritual burden of justice. He is emptying himself of the need to be the executioner.
Oh, wow. So he is essentially saying, I am so angry I could destroy these people, but I am handing this weapon to you so that I don't use it myself.
Yes. By giving the demand for justice to God, he acknowledges that true justice doesn't belong to him.
That connects so brilliantly to the historical narrative of David's life.
Yeah.
This internal venting actually enabled his external restraint.
The cave incident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We know that David eventually found himself in a cave with King Saul. Saul was completely vulnerable. David's own men were whispering in his ear, insisting this was a divine opportunity to take the throne, to just end the misery.
It was the perfect setup.
But David refused to kill him. He only cut off a piece of Saul's robe.
And the internal processing we see in the Psalms is exactly what made that moment of restraint possible.
It reminds me of the psychological practice of writing a furiously angry letter to someone who has deeply betrayed you. You know, you put down every horrible thing you want to say, every piece of revenge you fantasize about taking, you get it all out of your head and onto the paper.
And then you burn it.
Right. And by venting his wrath entirely to heaven, David ensured that his physical actions on earth remained restrained and pure.
And it's so important to note that God never rebukes David for this harsh language. The text suggests the divine priority is honesty over polite suppression. By releasing his right to vengeance, David steps into a level of spiritual maturity that was virtually non-existent in his historical era.
Right. The era of the judges, which preceded David, is crucial context here.
It was a deeply chaotic period. Think of the Judges era as a spiritual and moral breakdown, a time defined by the phrase, everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
A total free-for-all.
Exactly. Even the Levites, who were the priests charged with maintaining the spiritual health of the nation, had largely lost touch with the deep truths of the scriptures. They were essentially functioning on autopilot, completely disconnected from the core meaning of the law.
And yet here is David, a political refugee out in the dirt, actively studying the Torah. He isn't relying on a corrupted priesthood to mediate for him, right? He is meditating on the scriptures himself.
He's going direct to the source.
Yeah, he is transitioning from knowing facts about God to experiencing a face-to-face intimacy. And you see the result of that intimacy in Psalm 4. Despite an entire army hunting him with spears, he writes, "In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, Lord, make me dwell in safety."
And in Psalm 16, he declares God is his chosen portion. He doesn't say the throne is his portion, or his reputation, or his wealth. The wilderness refined his faith until literally nothing else remained.
Okay, I have to pause here, though, and push back on this narrative arc just a little bit. Because when we summarize it, it sounds so linear and triumphant, right? David goes to the desert, learns to rely on God, hands over his anger, and finds perfect, lasting peace. But reading Psalms 1 through 17 straight through doesn't feel like a neat upward trajectory.
Not even a little bit.
It feels erratic. It feels messy.
Well, the texts certainly don't follow a clean chronological progression of emotional healing.
Not at all. We just talked about Psalm 4, where he is sleeping peacefully surrounded by enemies. But you turn a few pages to Psalm 13, and he is spiraling completely.
He really is.
He is screaming, "How long will you forget me, Lord, forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" He talks about wrestling with his thoughts and having sorrow in his heart every single day. The peace is completely gone. So how do we reconcile the grounded, Torah-studying scholar who sleeps soundly with the panicked, traumatized fugitive who believes he has been abandoned to die?
It's such a great question. And honestly, the friction you are identifying is the very thing that gives these records their enduring power. The assumption we often make is that spiritual surrender or even healing from trauma is a permanent, static achievement.
Like checking a box.
Right. We assume that once you find peace, the panic never returns.
Which is how most modern self-help books frame it. 5 steps to permanent peace.
But the human nervous system doesn't work that way, and neither does the human spirit. The Psalms reject those cheap platitudes. They offer a highly realistic portrait of trauma and faith coexisting. The despair in Psalm 13 doesn't invalidate the peace of Psalm 4.
Right.
It simply reveals that surrender is a daily, sometimes hourly choice. What the Psalms map out is the real-time spiritual mechanism of moving from profound despair to transcendent praise over and over again.
Well, let's examine that mechanism closely, because the pivot within these poems is just fascinating. Let's look at Song 13 again. It starts with those agonizing questions. "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever?" He is pleading for an answer before he literally dies. But by the time we reach the final 2 verses of that exact same short poem, the tone shifts dramatically.
It really does. He says, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me."
He goes from "you've forgotten me forever" to "I will sing your praise" in the span of 6 verses. It feels like spiritual whiplash.
The key to understanding that whiplash is recognizing what has and what hasn't changed. Between verse 1 and verse 6 of Psalm 13, David's physical circumstances remain entirely identical.
So Saul is still out there.
King Saul hasn't called off the troops. The political assassination plot is still active. The cave is just as cold, and David is just as hungry.
The external threat is exactly the same, but the internal reality has been completely restructured.
Yes. Through the crucible of honest, unfiltered prayer, his focus undergoes a forcible shift. Because when a person is consumed by terror, their gaze is entirely horizontal. They are looking at the size of the threat, the immediate danger, the mechanics of their ruin.
They're scanning the horizon for the predator.
Exactly. But the act of vocalizing that fear to God breaks the horizontal fixation. It forces the gaze upward.
And that upward gaze is perfectly captured in Psalm 8. It's one of the most vivid images in this collection. You can easily envision David sitting outside his cave in the dead of night, looking up at the vast expanse of the desert sky. He writes, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind, that you are mindful of them, human beings, that you care for them?"
It is the ultimate exercise in perspective. When you deeply meditate on the architecture of the cosmos, the sheer scale of the universe, the political threats of a jealous king suddenly shrink.
They seem so small.
Right. The horizontal threat loses its paralyzing power when placed against the backdrop of divine majesty.
It's a cognitive reframing. He isn't denying the danger exists. He's just placing the danger next to something infinitely larger.
Which brings us to Psalm 12. Psalm 12 describes the words of the Lord as flawless, like silver refined in a furnace of clay, purified 7 times. The implication throughout these wilderness chapters is that David's own heart is the material inside that furnace. The
Wow.
relentless heat of his circumstances is burning off the impurities. The pride, the self-reliance, the need to control the outcome, it is all being systematically melted away.
Until we arrive at the profound conclusion of Psalm 17.
Yeah.
After spending the entire poem describing the wicked, these people who are entirely satisfied with temporary earthly wealth and power, David lands on a statement of absolute transcendent clarity. He says, "As for me, I will be vindicated and will see your face. When I awake, I will be satisfied with seeing your likeness."
It is the pinnacle of the wilderness training. He doesn't say he will be satisfied when he finally gets the crown. He doesn't say he will be satisfied when Saul is dead and his reputation is restored.
He just needs God.
Yeah.
The resistance within him has been completely yielded. The stripping away of every earthly comfort ultimately revealed the only foundation that couldn't be taken from him.
Which brings us to the application for the listener today, because these aren't just fascinating historical artifacts from a Bronze Age fugitive.
Right. They are a highly functional blueprint because the reality is you will face your own wilderness. You might be in it right now. It might be a sudden health crisis, a profound betrayal, a financial collapse, or, an intense period of isolation where every plan you had for your life has been completely derailed.
And the instinct in those moments is often to suppress the negative emotions,
Mhm.
right? To try and maintain a facade of control or polite faith. We think we need to clean ourselves up and present a calm, collected version of ourselves to God and to the world.
But David's journey absolutely shatters that requirement. The blueprint says you bring the raw, chaotic, unfiltered mess of your reality forward. You don't hide the anger, you hand it over. You don't suppress the feeling of abandonment, you scream it into the echoing cave of your own life.
Beautifully said.
And through that specific gritty process of honest prayer, the panic and the desire for vengeance are slowly, painfully refined into an unshakable peace.
We have traced a remarkable spiritual arc today through Psalms 1 through 17. We explored how the physical and psychological shock of the Judean wilderness served as a masterclass in dismantling human pride. We uncovered how brutal honesty and visceral lament are not signs of a weak faith, but rather the very mechanisms of surrendering our demand for vengeance to a higher judge.
And we tackled the messy, nonlinear reality of trauma, seeing how a person can pivot from profound despair to soaring praise within a single breath just by shifting their gaze. When you are surrounded by conflict, when fear is keeping you awake, the path forward isn't forcing a smile. It is surrendering those chaotic feelings utterly to a presence big enough to absorb them.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to carry with you. If David's most profound spiritual growth, his deepest surrender, and his most beautiful enduring legacy came not from the safety and comfort of a palace throne, but from the terrifying, dusty, unjust deprivation of the wilderness, what wilderness in your own life might actually be the very place your pure spiritual legacy is being written right now?
Take a moment to consider that the absolute lowest point in your life might just be the exact furnace where your masterpiece is being made.